Hello and welcome to O Sing Joyfully, a video and podcast series about sacred music in the church from the Cathedral Church of St. Paul. My name is Mary Grahame. I'm a laywoman and choir member at the cathedral, and I'm here today with Canon Jeremy David Tarrant, our organist and choir master.
Hello, Mary Grahame. Good morning.
Hi.
So
How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Just enjoying a last few days of vacation here, actually. But,
That's nice.
yeah. So we're going to talk
nice.
about.
So today,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, it's okay. Today we're talking about Anglican Chant, and so we're going to have a brief conversation about that as our next installment in our series about the Psalms.
Right. And so last time we were talking about the Psalms themselves. What are they? And now we get into sort of methods of singing them and ways of singing them. And so today I think we're talking about um, sort of the most common way, at least for us in the cathedral, in singing them in services, and that is Anglican chant.
So as the name suggests, that's particular to Anglican traditions. So for us, that's the Episcopal Church in the United States, but the Anglican Communion across the world.
Right. It's a pretty significant.
So tell me about.
Well, yeah, sure. I'm sorry. I keep interrupting you. I think it's for the Zoom
No, it's
thing
okay.
too. Yeah. What is it? Well, Anglican chant is a fairly simple, harmonized setting of a melody that's devised for psalm singing and singing the canticles. For instance, if you are tuning into our Sunday morning 11 o'clock uh, uh, Zoom virtual worship for morning prayer, we sing the Venite, the first of the invitatory psalms, to Anglican chant. And it's a setting for the congregation. Most of the time for Anglican chant these days, we're probably thinking of things that are sung by the choir, sort of in a cathedral situation. So what you have is this sort of formula, this melodic formula, if you will, that begins with a reciting tone over which most of the phrase is sung. Then you have what's called the mediant cadence, the cadence in the middle. Then a new reciting tone for the next phrase, and then a final cadence. And this really grew out of the plain chant tradition in the English Reformation, when composers were making harmonized versions of the traditional Gregorian chant or plain chant psalm tones. There's 8 of them. Later on, at the time of the restoration of the monarchy, when choirs and organists were returning to their posts, this tradition, of course, picked up again. But by the end of the 17th century, composers began constructing their own melodies, not necessarily using just the traditional psalm tones. And that's really when Anglican chant, as we know it, began to flourish. And perhaps a golden age might have been in the Victorian period. But that's what it is, this melodic formula.
And there are still chants being composed today. It's a living composing tradition.
Exactly. I mean, Anglican chant it's not as though we have this book of chants, and that it stopped at the 19th century. Chants are being written all the time. Sometimes inspired by specific psalms or canticles. Other times, a composer will write Anglican chants, maybe not with a specific psalm in mind, but just because it's a good chant and it's singable. I kind of hate that. It's singable, but there's some people just really good at writing them, and in our own Psalter that they've been working on for the cathedral choir, there are chants from just across the centuries. I mean, some written just recently.
That's a really cool way to be in touch with the history of the church. Just personally, for me as a singer, to know that I'm singing something that maybe we got from anyone from Thomas Tallis to Charles Perry, to something that was composed last year for us, for example. I just really like that idea. That's what I love about just choral music in general, is it's come down through the history of the church, is that, you know, you could be singing something that people sang in the 17th century.
Yeah, and with you saying that, we were talking about this last time about the tradition of psalm singing not being a museum piece, but that it is a living, breathing tradition. And at the risk of going down a rabbit hole here, which I maybe we'll have another uh, uh, talk about it sometime, it's sort of why I really do not appreciate things being listed as traditional or contemporary.
Mm.
Um, yes, there are some, there are traditions, but traditions are also living things as well. And so, when we have a group of, 9 and 10-year-olds singing the Bird Ave Verum, yes, this is music from centuries ago, but it's a group of people in the now singing this. And so I I don't like that. It almost seems divisive to me for us in the church to continue to use the terms traditional or contemporary as though they're sort of polar opposites without any connection.
Right, and it's what use does that binary type of thinking give us?
Right,
If it's not particularly useful,
right.
then probably we should go ahead and leave it behind.
Yeah,
And
probably.
I think that also makes it, if you get rid of that kind of distinction, it makes it harder to say, oh, that's old and we don't need it anymore.
Right, right, right. But you and I are also history buffs and
We
appreciate how, we have a great appreciation for history, but also the way it informs us and the way it has formed us not only as people, but it's the way we think and all that. Uh,
And I would venture to say, you know, talking about the English restoration of the monarchy as this time when Anglican chant really starts to flourish, well, that's also when we get the 1662 Book of Common Prayer that is still in use in the Church of
mhm,
England.
mhm,
And so I would say that one doesn't like to make sweeping generalizations about Anglican identity, partly because I think it's difficult to make one that's true. Um, but I would say that Episcopalians do like to be in touch with that history, even though we
mhm.
keep updating. In the United States, we keep updating the prayer book, and our most recent one is from the 1970s. We're still using collects written by Thomas Cranmer in the 16th
Right,
century. Like
right.
we've inherited this, well, it's an inheritance of prayer and how people
Yeah,
have prayed,
yeah,
and we've in some cases held on to that, and I think that there's value in that.
mhm,
So
yeah. Wow. Well, we didn't go down the rabbit hole completely, but that's probably worth an episode at some point.
absolutely. So
with
stay tuned.
yeah, maybe with a
Stay tuned
call.
for future episodes.
Yeah, maybe with call-ins and everything.
Oh, yes, yes.
But back to
But
Anglican.
I think that that's a good segue into how we use Anglican chant at the cathedral. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Right. I do want to though talk about before we get to that, if you don't mind, about how do the words fit with the music? How is that
Oh, absolutely.
organized?
Hmm.
Um, which you were probably going to ask me in a second, but just because my brain needs to hold on to it.
Of
So you
course.
you got this music, and then okay, so what about the words? How do you fit it all in? Well, it's really governed by speech rhythm. We have an organization of the words that we call pointing. You point to the text, and there are symbols used to show you where the note changes in the phrase, for instance. Um, and it's actually, I think we were saying before that there are elements of it that are um, the same, but it can vary from psalter to psalter because they were putting it together. I mean, depending on who's putting it together. Um, but it's very much guided by the speech rhythm and the what you have in in a psalter for the choir, for instance, is the chant at the top, and then the text um, with the pointing, showing the choir where the changes happen. Um, it's really something that it's a language that the choir can learn and digest get very good at by doing it. In fact, when we teach it to the choristers, we sort of teach it in reverse. We give them an unpointed text, and then have them point it, and that's how they learn the sort of basic elements of it. Sometimes we don't use a psalm text. They paraphrased for me one day a story I was telling them about going to Tim Hortons and dropping my donut on the way out. So they made a little story about it and then pointed it. And gosh, if that's what teaches it, that's great, you know.
We should do a virtual choir recording of the Ballad of the Dropped Donut set to Anglican Chant. Look out for it. I also encourage anyone who is watching/listening to this to go to the internet and search for, there's a number of recordings and compilations of things that are not Anglican chant being sung to Anglican chant, such as the highway code, the shipping news, the rules of cricket. And I just think that it's really, really funny to hear things that are emphatically not the Psalms being sung in a very quintessentially English fashion
Yeah.
to various Anglican chants.
I remember a Shrove Tuesday many years ago when Chris Hooker, one of our parishioners and former clerk of the works, she and I sang the pancake recipe to Anglican chant for the Shrove
We're
Tuesday
making that
talent
happen
show.
for next year.
Yeah, we might have to resurrect something like that.
We're gonna have to, yeah. If nothing else comes out of this project other than these videos and that, it will be worth all of the time.
But you asked about how all this is used in the cathedral, and as I was saying in our last episode, um, the choir sings the psalms to Anglican chant in the principal service on Sundays and at evensong. Um, I decided to continue a tradition that was um, really one of my predecessor, and that is using plain chant instead of Anglican chant in Advent and in Lent to kind of give a different flavor to the psalm singing in those liturgical seasons. When the choir is in their summer recess, we have various ways of singing the psalms in the services. Um, uh, Sometimes using a simplified Anglican chant with the congregation, where the changes don't happen as often. We also use that at Cathedral Evensong, which is our version of Evensong that's not sung by the choir. So that's how it's used in the cathedral. And I feel fortunate to work in a cathedral that still maintains that tradition, because it's, as you were talking about, I think at the beginning, it's a very important part of our musical heritage, of our Anglican musical heritage, and so it's an important part of us. And so I'm glad that um, we can not only maintain it but encourage new chants and new harmonies and things like that.
Absolutely. And I expect that we'll talk a bit more about this in the episode that we do on translation. But I also think it's particularly interesting that by the time Anglican chant flourishes in the late 17th century, the liturgy of the Anglican Church has been in English for nearly 100 years at that point. So I'm just also particularly interested that this is a sung form that's developed around the speech patterns of a language we still use. Because of course you can sing the Latin, the plain chant was often, that was used to sing the Psalms in Latin, and you can use it to sing the Psalms in I think probably any language. But I think it's very interesting the way that music composed for a certain language, you know, fits itself around a certain language. We have anthems that that were maybe originally in Latin or originally in French, and in some editions you'll get an English translation with it, and it's just not quite the same. You know, I can't imagine doing something like the Cantique de Jean Racine not in French.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's just really interesting that this musical pattern of Anglican chant has really grown up around English, and that we still get to do that. And this isn't, I mean, not to privilege English as like the best language ever or anything, because what is up with the spelling, among other things. but
Right.
it is our mother tongue.
Right.
So I just find that fascinating.
Yeah, oftentimes, you know, you'll have an English translation, like in the Cantique de Jean Racine, that might be helpful, if the choir doesn't speak French. I mean, they might be singing in French, but not necessarily speak French. And so, you know, sometimes an English translation given in the score can be helpful for helping us to understand what it is we're singing. But they're not always great alternatives to the text themselves. So, yeah.
Was there anything
I
else?
think you had a. No, I'm just trying to think.
Because we've talked about kind of the things that are important to remember as you sing, which is the natural speech rhythms, and that really the only way to get good at it is to do it, which is true of basically everything to do with music.
Exactly, and we talked about this in our first episode. When we were talking about, you know, how does the choir get good at it? Well, they get good at it from doing it. And I think, you know, for those worshipers in the pew that are participating in those parts of the service where we might have, uh, you know, simplified chant or a canticle sung to Anglican chant. If you don't get it the first time, for heaven's sake, don't worry about it. I mean, you'll have you'll have another chance. But uh, the same with a hymn that you might not have encountered before. We tend not to introduce a new hymn or an unfamiliar hymn and then just leave it at that. Generally, you know, it's planned to be repeated at various points in the season, so it can become part of our repertoire. So just like I don't sit down and learn a new, maybe a prelude and fugue of Bach that is new to me in one sitting, you know, it takes more than one service, you know, to do those.
Well, and certainly right now with our services being online, the parishioner at home who maybe hasn't had a lot of experience with Anglican chant before, this is your time,
Yeah.
because we're all doing it from our own living room,
Yeah.
or wherever you may go to online church.
Right.
And stick with it. We're all gonna be so good at Anglican chant when we get back.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just all about, you know, it takes a while to get, you know, into you. And as I said before, um, I take pride in the fact that the cathedral choir does it so well, but it's really only because we're given the opportunity to do it on a weekly basis, and sometimes more than one service in the week with that. So that's an important thing to remember. But I think it's important to remember that in all we do in music. I mean, um, you know, certainly if you hear a new hymn for the first time, you're gonna have a reaction to it. But things bear repeated hearings and you know, looking at them again. So it's the same.
And I think on the flip side, in terms of, you know, perhaps a chant that's very familiar, I can think of half a dozen chants that I could sing off the top of my head right now because we've done them so many times. And I remember you once saying that, you know, the minute you think you've learned absolutely everything from a piece, and that could be anything from a simple psalm chant to a big festival anthem, you said the minute you think that you've learned everything, you should just go hang up your surplice, because
Yeah.
if you're not open to constantly learning new things from the music that maybe you never never thought about or paid attention to before, then it's not the right mindset to be making music with.
I think that's really true. I mean, it's one of the wonderful things about art. There's no concept of it that's ever final. There are
Hmm.
there are things there are such things as musical truths and artistic truths and common understandings and elements. But you know, um, it's sort of like walking into the cathedral. I've worked there for coming up on 26 years, but I still find, I'm taking a practice break or something, walking around the cathedral, and I'm discovering new things all the time about that art or something that I didn't see the same way the first time. Um, but it is one of the wonderful things about music is that it's always changing and growing, and you can change and grow with it. I remember my very first organ teacher. I had played a piece particularly well or something, and he said at the end of that, I can't, you play this very well. I really want to hear you play it when you're 50. You know, to, but I think it's the same in all music. Even with the way, you might have sung the same psalm to the same chant for, your whole career, but the things in our lives that are going on around us, might change the way that we hear it or think about it. So,
Absolutely.
well, we're in coming up episodes. We'll talk about plain chant and Gregorian chant. I think we're going to also talk about translations. Um,
Yes.
I know that going out of this episode, one can hear the choir sing a psalm to Anglican chant, but also on the screen, you'll see the text pointed, so you see what that sort of looks like.
Yeah,
So
so everyone gets
think,
the choir's eye view of
yeah,
what we have in our
exactly.
music folders.
Choir's eye view, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, before we move into that, I'm just going to tell you about some places you can find us on the internet. Our website is detroitcathedral.org. You can go there for information on worship resources. As of today, which is towards the end of June, we are still doing our worship online. Um, our Facebook page is Cathedral Church of St. Paul, Detroit. We also have a separate Facebook page for the music, which I believe is Music at Cathedral Church of St. Paul. Our YouTube, which you may have already found because you may be watching us here, is Cathedral Church of St. Paul, Detroit. Our Instagram is St. Paul's Detroit. So that's Saint abbreviated ST, Paul's with no apostrophe, Detroit. Our SoundCloud is Detroit Cathedral Choir. So if you're looking for recordings of us, I'm sure there's some psalms on there, but also anthems and hymns. Please feel free to go check that out. Our podcast, which you might also have found, you might be listening to us there as well, is the Cathedral Church of St. Paul, Detroit. In addition to these episodes, we also have a variety of sermons that are uploaded to the podcast weekly. And you can get in touch with us. Our email is music@detroitcathedral.org. So if you have questions you want us to answer, or if you have suggestions for future episode topics, please get in touch with us there.
Great. Thanks so much, Mary Graham. Have a great day.
My pleasure. See you next time.
Okay, talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.